Dr. Daniel Harris woke up to the hum of his alarm clock, a soft reminder that the day ahead would be just like any other. He had never been one for routine changes, appreciating the order and predictability that came with his work as the chief medical examiner in the small town of Harlington. The people in the community respected him, not just for his expertise in forensic pathology, but for his calm, measured demeanor. He had risen through the ranks by working tirelessly, never expecting accolades but quietly enjoying the respect that came from making life-and-death decisions that others weren't prepared to make. The early morning was quiet, save for the chirping of birds outside his window. He took his time to prepare a simple breakfast, just some toast and coffee, before getting dressed for the day ahead. He knew there was a lot of work waiting for him at the hospital, but there was also a conference later in the day. It was a gathering of medical professionals where he had been invited to speak about the ethical challenges in modern forensic work, a subject close to his heart. The topic wasn't glamorous, but it was important, and he was passionate about ensuring that medical science continued to evolve with integrity. As he grabbed his briefcase and keys, Dr. Harris left his home and drove down the quiet suburban streets toward the hospital. Harlington was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where familiarity often gave way to comfort but also sometimes to a narrow perspective. People often viewed Dr. Harris as an unapproachable figure because of his serious work, but he was, in fact, a deeply caring man who tried to help those in need wherever possible. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Officer Jake Sullivan started his day with a different kind of anticipation. Having moved to Harlington just a year ago, he was still trying to find his place. He had grown up in a large city, and the small-town pace was both refreshing and frustrating. It felt like everyone knew everyone else's business, but Sullivan had his eyes set on proving himself as a valuable member of the police force. He'd been stuck in the shadows of more experienced officers, and this was a town where things generally ran smoothly. There were no high-speed chases or major criminal activities to deal with, just the occasional traffic stop or minor disturbance. But Jake was eager. He had a new sense of purpose. Today was going to be different. He had heard about a string of robberies in nearby neighborhoods, and he was determined to catch the criminals responsible, even if that meant stepping outside of his usual comfort zone. As he sat in his patrol car, going over the details of the case, his mind raced with possibilities of what could be out there, who might be lurking just beyond his grasp. The encounter began as a simple traffic stop, a routine part of every officer's day. Dr. Harris, caught up in his thoughts about the upcoming conference and the speech he had spent weeks preparing for, didn't even notice the flashing lights behind him. He had just pulled out onto Main Street when the sirens blared, startling him into focusing on the rear-view mirror. It was a typical stop, or so he thought. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolled down his window, and waited for the officer to approach. Officer Sullivan, on the other hand, was scanning the area for any sign of the suspects he had been briefed about. He had received a description of a vehicle involved in the robberies, and Dr. Harris's car, a sleek black sedan, seemed to fit the vague profile. He approached the vehicle with caution, already feeling a rush of adrenaline as he prepared to question the driver. His hands tightened on his belt as he approached, not recognizing the man behind the wheel, nor the fact that he was a well-known figure in the community. "Good morning, sir," Officer Sullivan said, his tone sharp but professional. "Can I see your license and registration?" Dr. Harris, taken off guard, hesitated for just a moment before reaching for his glove compartment. "Sure, officer," he replied, his voice calm. "Is there a problem?" Sullivan glanced at him closely, trying to read his expression. The hesitation didn't sit well with him. Dr. Harris wasn't acting nervous, he was just acting normal. But that normalcy made the officer suspicious. He had heard about a string of robberies that had taken place recently, and now here was a man in an expensive car, who seemed a little too composed for the situation. Was he trying to hide something? "I need you to step out of the vehicle, sir," Sullivan said, his voice growing more forceful. "I need to check your ID." Dr. Harris felt the shift in tone, but he complied. There was something in the officer's voice that made him uneasy. He stepped out of the car, still trying to figure out what this was all about. "I'm just on my way to work," he said, attempting to diffuse the tension with an explanation. "I'm the chief medical examiner. I have an appointment at the hospital." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. The chief medical examiner? He was skeptical, unsure of the man standing in front of him. Something didn't feel right, but Dr. Harris's claim was too formal to dismiss without further investigation. "Can you prove that?" Sullivan asked, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The tension in the air thickened. Dr. Harris took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of peacefulness. "I don't have to prove anything to you, officer," he replied, trying to remain composed. "I've done nothing wrong. I don't understand why you're questioning me like this." But Sullivan wasn't convinced. He had been trained to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him that this was someone trying to hide something. "You're acting evasive, sir," he said, his voice growing more insistent. "Step back toward the car. I'm arresting you on suspicion of resisting arrest." Dr. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as he was handcuffed, confusion and disbelief flooding his mind. "What do you mean, arrest?" he asked, still unsure how this had escalated so quickly. "You can't just arrest me for nothing." The officer's face remained impassive as he led Dr. Harris toward the squad car. The sound of distant sirens grew louder in the background, but it was the unmistakable hum of social media videos starting to stream online that would soon make this incident something much bigger than anyone could have anticipated. As Officer Sullivan read Dr. Harris his rights, he couldn't shake the growing sense that he had just made a terrible mistake. But at that moment, it was too late to turn back. Dr. Harris was shoved into the back of the squad car with a force that felt out of place. He tried to stay calm, to remind himself that this was just a misunderstanding, but the sting of the cuffs digging into his wrists was sharp and immediate. His mind raced. How had things spiraled so quickly? He couldn't make sense of it. He had been stopped for a routine traffic violation. He was a respected figure in the community. He should have been allowed to go on his way. Instead, he was sitting in the back of a police car, his entire world turning upside down. Officer Sullivan slammed the door of the squad car shut and walked briskly to his patrol vehicle. Dr. Harris tried to steady his breathing, the steady thump of his heart the only sound in the cramped back seat. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that might explain this madness. Was it just a case of racial profiling? Or was the officer's inexperience playing a role? In either case, this was getting out of hand fast. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, before Sullivan returned to the car. He looked slightly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. His fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel as he reviewed Dr. Harris's identification, and for the first time, doubt seemed to creep into his demeanor. "You're the chief medical examiner?" he asked, his voice sounding less certain than before. Dr. Harris exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "I've told you that. I'm a doctor. The chief medical examiner for Harlington. I don't know why you're treating me like a criminal." He knew his words were falling on deaf ears. The situation had long gone beyond logic. Sullivan had made his decision. The doubt that was starting to form in the officer's mind didn't change the fact that Dr. Harris was now being treated like a suspect. Sullivan leaned out of the car window and began speaking into his radio. "I've got an ID for a Dr. Daniel Harris. Chief medical examiner." "Yeah, no. He says he works at the hospital. I need to confirm if he's who he says he is." The radio crackled back a response. Sullivan nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. But as he waited, the minutes felt endless, each one sinking Dr. Harris further into an emotional abyss. Then, in the distance, Dr. Harris heard a siren. It was a local news van, followed by a couple of cars from the town's more curious citizens who had gathered around. The presence of cameras was a shock. How quickly word had spread. By the time the confirmation came through on Sullivan's radio, Dr. Harris was no longer just a man caught in a misunderstanding, he had become a spectacle. The officers were too busy trying to handle the crowd, attempting to clear the area, to process what had happened. Sullivan approached the squad car again, his expression now grim, the weight of his mistake hanging heavily between them. "Dr. Harris, I'm sorry. I had no idea who you were. But you can understand why I had to follow protocol, right?" Dr. Harris stared straight ahead, his thoughts now clouded with confusion and anger. "You don't even know who I am, and you're arresting me?" His voice was steady, though the words cut deep. "I've been working for this community for years. You think you can just treat people like criminals without knowing anything about them?" Sullivan didn't know how to respond. He was trained to follow orders, but there was a subtle, undeniable shift happening within him. What he had thought was a simple arrest now felt like a huge misstep. Still, he stuck to his routine, pulling Dr. Harris from the back of the car and escorting him into the station. The officers who had gathered to manage the scene all watched in silence, unsure whether to intervene or wait for the process to play out. The weight of the situation continued to grow. As they arrived at the station, Sullivan handed Dr. Harris over to another officer, who led him into the holding area. The paperwork began, and for the first time in his career, Sullivan questioned whether he had the authority to take such a drastic step. This wasn't a case of a criminal being brought in. This was an upstanding member of the community, a man who had saved lives, who had led investigations into untold tragedies, and now, he was being treated as a criminal. The quiet buzz of a police station was suddenly drowned out by phone calls, messages, and the news vans outside, all broadcasting the story. Social media platforms lit up, and within minutes, Dr. Harris's name was everywhere. What started as a routine arrest was now the center of a storm. The public's reaction was split. Some called for accountability, others blamed Dr. Harris for escalating the situation. But no one seemed to see the bigger picture, the tension between authority and those they serve, the fear of judgment, and the erosion of trust. Meanwhile, Dr. Harris was left in the cold, sterile holding room. His suit, now wrinkled from the ordeal, felt like a physical manifestation of the discomfort and disbelief he was feeling. He had always known that being an African American in a field where he was often one of the few was difficult, but this was a new low. His entire life, his career, was at the mercy of a decision that seemed driven by something deeper than just protocol. The minutes dragged on, and it felt like hours before an officer came to get him. It was the same officer who had greeted him at the car earlier. "You're free to go," he said. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the trauma he'd just endured. Dr. Harris just nodded, his mind still reeling from the series of events that had unfolded. He hadn't been in a holding cell for long, but the emotional weight of being arrested, especially without understanding why, was unbearable. As he walked out of the station, he could hear the murmurs of the growing crowd outside. News reporters stood ready with cameras, eager to get Dr. Harris's side of the story. But he didn't have the energy to speak, not yet. He just wanted to go home, to process the last few hours that had been anything but ordinary. He reached his car, taking a moment to breathe before getting in. His hands shook as he started the engine. The idea of the conference that was supposed to be his focus felt distant now. How could he go on with his life, knowing the entire town was talking about him, many of them without knowing the full story? As he drove home, the weight of the situation only grew heavier. Dr. Harris wasn't just thinking about himself anymore. His mind was filled with questions about the broader impact of what had happened. How would this affect the community? Would anyone believe the truth of what happened? Or would it always be remembered as a moment of injustice, a flashpoint in a growing divide between those in power and those who felt they were constantly being scrutinized? This was just the beginning. The events that had unfolded in a matter of hours would change everything. The community, the officer, and Dr. Harris himself would never be the same again. And though it would take time to unravel the full consequences of that fateful day, one thing was certain: this was no ordinary arrest. It was a moment that would set the stage for a much larger reckoning. The following days felt like a blur for Dr. Harris. The world had shifted, and he was left grappling with the fallout from the arrest. News reports continued to spin the story in every direction, but no one seemed to grasp the full weight of what had happened. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about the entire system that allowed it to happen, about the racial undertones that seemed to drive every misstep. Dr. Harris couldn't help but feel that he had become a symbol of something much bigger than himself. As the story continued to unfold in the media, public opinion was divided. Some people were supportive, rallying behind him as a victim of an unjust system. Others, however, were quick to judge, accusing him of playing the race card and of escalating a simple situation. The noise outside was deafening, but inside his home, Dr. Harris found himself trapped in his thoughts, unable to focus on anything. He had always kept his private life separate from his professional one, but now it felt like every moment was under the microscope. The phone calls came non-stop: friends, family, colleagues, offering words of support or asking if he was okay. But the truth was, Dr. Harris didn't know if he would ever be okay again. The weight of it all pressed heavily on his shoulders. One evening, a knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Officer Sullivan, standing on the doorstep, looking uncomfortable in his uniform. Dr. Harris stood still for a moment, unsure of what to say. The officer had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the past few days. His actions had turned Dr. Harris's life upside down, and now here he was, on his doorstep, seeking redemption in some form. Dr. Harris's first instinct was to turn him away, to shut the door and move on with his life. But then, something in Sullivan's eyes caught his attention: guilt, uncertainty, a look that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. "I know this isn't the time, but I wanted to come by and apologize," Sullivan said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying regret. I made a mistake. I didn't realize who you were. I didn't handle things the way I should have." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I never wanted to hurt you. I'm sorry." For a long moment, Dr. Harris didn't respond. He wasn't sure what he could say. He wasn't sure if words could undo the damage that had been done. But he understood the officer's sincerity. It wasn't an apology meant to erase the past few days, it was an acknowledgement of the pain, the chaos, the consequences. The damage was done, but perhaps, just perhaps, there could be some healing. "I appreciate the apology, Sullivan," Dr. Harris said quietly. "But an apology won't fix this. It won't fix the trust that's been broken, not just between us, but with the entire community." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "You have to understand that what happened wasn't just about one incident. It's about years of distrust, years of people being treated unfairly. This wasn't just about me, this is about the way systems work, and how easy it is for things to spiral out of control." Sullivan nodded slowly, taking in the words. "I understand. I really do. And I know there's nothing I can say to make up for it. But I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make things right." The sincerity in his voice gave Dr. Harris pause. It wasn't often that people took responsibility for their actions, especially not in the face of public scrutiny. For a moment, Dr. Harris wondered if this was the beginning of a change, not just for the officer, but for the community as a whole. Could this incident, painful as it was, serve as a catalyst for something bigger? Could it lead to real conversations about racial injustice, about the flaws in the system, about how to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they were supposed to protect? But as he stood there, staring at the officer on his doorstep, Dr. Harris couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. The road to healing wasn't going to be simple, and it wouldn't be quick. For every apology, there would be a dozen questions, 1,000 opinions, 1,000,000 assumptions. It wasn't just about fixing one mistake, it was about dismantling an entire structure that had been built on years of misunderstanding and inequality. And in that moment, Dr. Harris realized that his fight was far from over. In the days that followed, the town of Harlington was divided. Protests started to spring up around the police station, organized by a mix of local activists and concerned citizens. They were calling for accountability, for the officer to be held responsible for his actions, for the entire police force to examine its practices and biases. Dr. Harris, caught in the middle, found himself in a position he never expected. He was no longer just a witness to a moment of injustice, he was now the focal point of a larger movement. The town square was filled with voices, angry voices, hopeful voices, confused voices. Dr. Harris had always believed in the power of dialogue, in the idea that difficult conversations could lead to change. But now, as he stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and protesters, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. The enormity of what had happened weighed heavily on him. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the future of his town, his community, and the people who looked to him for leadership. Later that afternoon, a press conference was scheduled, and Dr. Harris knew he had to speak. He had to say something, even if he didn't know exactly what that something was. As the cameras flashed and the microphones were shoved in his face, he took a deep breath and began. "I want to start by saying this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happened to me was wrong. I was treated unfairly. But it's not just about me. This is about every person who's ever been unfairly judged because of their race, their appearance, or their background. This is about a system that needs to change. It's about accountability, not just for one officer, but for all of us. We all have a role to play in making this community better, in ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The room fell silent. There was a quiet intensity in Dr. Harris's words, a weight that hung in the air. The press, the protesters, the town, everyone was listening. This was no longer just about an arrest. It was about change. Real, hard, uncomfortable change. And Dr. Harris knew that the road ahead would be long, and that it would take everything he had to fight for it. But in that moment, he also realized something else. He was no longer just an observer. He was a leader, a voice for a community that had too often been silenced. And with that realization came a deep sense of purpose. This was the beginning of something bigger than him. And he wasn't going to back down. The days that followed the press conference felt like an endless whirlwind for Dr. Harris. Harlington was a town on the edge, caught between simmering frustration and a fragile hope that real change might be possible. The community was divided, and every step Dr. Harris took felt like it carried the weight of an entire movement. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore, he was fighting for the very future of his town, the fabric of its relationships, and the trust between law enforcement and the citizens they vowed to protect. Public protests continued, some in support of Dr. Harris, demanding justice and reform, others questioning whether the entire ordeal had been blown out of proportion. Local leaders, politicians, and civil rights organizations began to speak out, adding fuel to the fire. The media, meanwhile, had adopted the story with a frenzy, dissecting every element of the incident. They wanted answers, but more than anything, they wanted drama. The narrative was twisted at times. Dr. Harris was portrayed as both a victim and a symbol of systemic injustice. At other times, he was depicted as a reluctant hero caught up in forces much larger than himself. Through all of it, Dr. Harris found himself growing more weary with each passing day. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, people offering their opinions, and local reporters who seemed less interested in his side of the story than in the drama that had unfolded. He knew the attention was inevitable, but the toll it was taking on him, on his family, was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just about the press anymore. It was about his relationships with the people he cared about, the community he had dedicated his life to serving. The scrutiny was turning every corner of his life into a battleground. One morning, his phone buzzed incessantly on the kitchen counter. It was a call from the hospital, the place where Dr. Harris had spent most of his life. He didn't pick up immediately, knowing that it could be just another interruption. But when the voicemail light blinked, he pressed play, hearing the voice of Dr. Linda Perez, one of his closest colleagues, urgently requesting his presence at a meeting with the hospital board. With a sigh, he dialed her back, wondering what new storm he was about to face. "Dan, we need you here." Dr. Perez's voice was clipped, tense. "The board is meeting to discuss the fallout from all of this, and they need your input. The situation is affecting not just your role as chief medical examiner, but the hospital's reputation as a whole. People are talking. There's pressure from both sides. You need to come." Dr. Harris rubbed his face, trying to process the weight of it all. "I'm coming, Linda. I'll be there." When he arrived at the hospital, the tension was palpable. The boardroom was filled with top hospital administrators, department heads, and legal representatives. Dr. Harris walked in, his heart heavy, knowing that the conversation would be anything but easy. Dr. Perez greeted him with a brief nod, but even she couldn't mask the anxiety in her eyes. As the meeting began, the room quickly descended into a mix of concern and confusion. The administrators voiced their worries about the hospital's reputation, about the negative press, and the questions that were being raised about Dr. Harris's relationship with the police force. Some board members felt the incident was a distraction that could harm their work, and they were looking for solutions. Others, however, were more empathetic. They understood that this wasn't just about Dr. Harris, it was about the system's failure, about the systemic issues that had led to this moment. But still, the pressure was mounting, and everyone was beginning to feel it. "Dr. Harris, I need to ask you directly," one of the board members, a middle-aged woman in a sharp suit, said, her tone cold but professional. "Given the nature of these events, do you believe you can continue in your role as chief medical examiner with the community's confidence intact?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, one that Dr. Harris wasn't prepared to answer. He had always known that his position came with scrutiny, but never had he felt so alone in that role. It wasn't just about his career anymore, it was about something much more personal. His integrity, his values, his commitment to the community, everything he had worked for was now being called into question, not by criminals or colleagues, but by those who had once trusted him. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to steady his thoughts. "I never wanted to be in this position. I didn't ask for this. But what I know is this: the community has been divided, and we can't pretend that this was just about one mistake. This is about something much larger, something we've all been ignoring for too long. We can't afford to turn a blind eye to the injustice that's out there. But at the same time, I'm not going to pretend that I'm unaffected by what's happened. I've been hurt by this, just like the rest of us. But my duty to the people of Harlington hasn't changed." There was a long silence after his words. The room seemed to be waiting for the final verdict, but Dr. Harris couldn't bring himself to make that decision. He didn't know if he could continue under the microscope, if he could live with the constant tension that was now part of his everyday life. He wasn't sure he could still serve as the symbol of hope that many people had placed on his shoulders. But, he realized, there was still a part of him that wasn't ready to give up, not yet. After what felt like an eternity, the board began to discuss their options. They considered a temporary suspension, public statements, and how to approach the press. The room buzzed with the murmur of conversations as Dr. Harris sat in silence, knowing that every decision being made would ripple through his life in ways that were still unclear. But what was clearer than ever was the cost of all of this, the price of standing up for something, of being thrust into a battle that was far bigger than any one person. His voice had been heard, but now it was time to see if anyone was truly listening. When the meeting ended, Dr. Harris left the boardroom feeling even more uncertain. The struggle was far from over, and the choice before him was no longer simply about his career, it was about whether he could continue to stand in the face of a system that had failed him, his community, and countless others. He stepped outside, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but also a small spark of something else. A determination to keep fighting, to make sure that this wasn't just another moment in time that faded into the background. No, this would be the moment that sparked change, the moment when the truth finally came to light. He wasn't going to let this be forgotten. The fight for justice had just begun. The weeks that followed the board meeting were a blur of chaos and hard decisions. Dr. Harris found himself at a crossroads, forced to confront the many layers of the situation that had unfolded before him. The pressure was relentless. With each passing day, the divide in the community seemed to grow wider, and the scrutiny surrounding his actions as chief medical examiner intensified. While some saw him as a symbol of strength in the face of adversity, others saw him as an obstacle to their sense of normalcy. But Dr. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, though painful, was a necessary catalyst for change. The town of Harlington, once a quiet and mostly peaceful place, was now a hotbed of unrest. Protests continued to swell, people demanding accountability not just from Officer Sullivan, but from the entire system that had allowed such mistakes to happen. The hospital board had agreed to stand by Dr. Harris for the time being, but they made it clear that if the situation didn't improve, they would have no choice but to reconsider his position. They offered him a choice, to step away quietly or stay and fight for the future. It was the kind of ultimatum that gnawed at him every night. But despite the mounting pressure, Dr. Harris refused to be silenced. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to just walk away when things got tough. His entire life had been devoted to his role in the community, and he wasn't going to let this moment of injustice define him. He had a responsibility, not just to his job, but to the people who depended on him, and to the generations before him who had fought for equality and justice. This wasn't just about his career or his reputation. It was about the broader fight for fairness, for change in a system that was broken in ways no one had dared to confront before. One evening, as the sun began to set, Dr. Harris sat down with his wife, Michelle. The weight of everything was starting to break him down, and he knew he needed her strength. Michelle had been his rock throughout the entire ordeal, offering him a calm and unwavering support even as the world seemed to crumble around them. She had seen the toll it had taken on him, long hours, sleepless nights, endless phone calls and messages. They both knew things couldn't continue like this. They had to decide what came next, together. Dan, you've been through so much already. I see the toll it's taking on you, on us, Michelle said softly, her eyes filled with concern. But you've always told me that when it comes to doing the right thing, you can't back down. You've made a difference in this town before. Maybe it's time to use that voice of yours again. Not just for you, but for all the people who feel voiceless. Dr. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known that his work wasn't just about the medicine, it was about using his position to do good, to be a force for change in a community that was often too quiet in the face of injustice. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, he was unsure if he had the strength to carry the burden. I know, Michelle. But what if it doesn't work? What if the system is too broken to fix? He asked, the uncertainty creeping into his voice. I've seen so many people try and fail before. What if all of this ends up being in vain? Michelle reached across the table and took his hand. You'll never know unless you try. You've already changed so many lives, Dan. This is just one more chapter in a much bigger story. You don't have to fix everything alone. You're not in this fight by yourself. We all are. Her words resonated with him deeply. He couldn't keep running from this fight, couldn't allow fear and doubt to dictate his actions. If he truly wanted change, he would have to confront it head-on, no matter how daunting it seemed. He had always been the one to step up when things got tough, and this time would be no different. The next morning, Dr. Harris made a decision. He wasn't going to back down. He would use the platform he had to push for real reform, to demand accountability and change, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been affected by a broken system. He reached out to local activists, community leaders, and even his colleagues at the hospital. Together, they began to form a coalition, one that would stand up for racial equality, for better policing practices, and for true accountability. They organized town hall meetings, open forums where people could speak their truth without fear of retribution, and work together to find real solutions. Despite the ongoing protests, there was a shift in the air. More people began to join the cause, not just because of what had happened to Dr. Harris, but because they realized that the fight for justice went beyond one officer's mistake. It was about creating a community where everyone, regardless of race, was treated with dignity and respect. Dr. Harris found himself at the forefront of this movement, leading with the same quiet strength that had always defined him. But change was never going to come easily. There were still people who resisted, who clung to outdated ideologies and were afraid of what reform might bring. The hospital board continued to apply pressure, warning that if the situation didn't improve, they would have to reevaluate his position. The police department, too, was torn. Some officers were supportive of Dr. Harris's calls for reform, while others saw him as a threat to the established order. Even Officer Sullivan, who had initially apologized, found himself caught in the middle of the division within the force. Yet despite the challenges, Dr. Harris remained resolute. The emotional toll was high, and there were moments when he wanted to give up. But every time he looked into the eyes of the people in his community, especially the young faces who saw him as a symbol of hope, he knew he couldn't stop now. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. It wasn't until one cold evening several months later that Dr. Harris saw the first real signs of progress. A meeting was called between the police chief, the mayor, and community leaders to discuss police reform. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't undo the damage of the past, but it was a start. Policies were being drafted to address racial bias within the police force, and new training programs were being implemented. There were promises of greater transparency and accountability, with the goal of restoring trust between law enforcement and the community. Dr. Harris felt a sense of cautious optimism, but he knew this was only the beginning. There would be more battles ahead, more resistance to face. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like change was within reach. The road to healing was long, but it was a road worth traveling. And as he looked out at the community he had fought so hard to protect, he knew that no matter what happened next, he had made a difference. The fight was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. And that, in itself, was enough to keep going. The months that followed Dr. Harris's decision to stand firm were a blur of public meetings, media scrutiny, and endless conversations with leaders across the community. Change didn't come swiftly, but the steady push for reform began to take root. The hospital board, which had once been unsure of Dr. Harris's future, now fully supported his vision of transformation. They recognized that his leadership was critical, not just for the integrity of the hospital but for the town as a whole. Slowly, the atmosphere in Harlington began to shift. What had once felt like a fracture in the community was slowly being stitched back together, thread by painful thread. Dr. Harris worked tirelessly, meeting with local law enforcement, attending town halls, and collaborating with activists who had once viewed him with suspicion. He spoke at rallies, not just about the injustice he had experienced, but about the systemic changes that needed to be made to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same humiliation. He wasn't just pushing for change in the police department, he was advocating for better healthcare, better education, and better opportunities for everyone, especially the marginalized communities that had long been ignored. As the reforms began to take shape, Officer Sullivan found himself in a position he had never anticipated. The initial anger and bitterness that had surrounded the incident had faded, replaced by something more complicated: guilt. He had never imagined his actions would ignite such a firestorm, let alone a movement that was so far-reaching. He had always been proud of his position in the police force, but now he couldn't escape the weight of what he had done. Dr. Harris had become a symbol of the very thing he had sworn to protect, and Sullivan knew he could never undo the damage. But he could try to make amends. One rainy afternoon, Officer Sullivan reached out to Dr. Harris. He wasn't sure what he expected from the conversation, maybe anger, maybe a cold dismissal, but what he received was something different. Dr. Harris agreed to meet him at a local coffee shop, a neutral ground for an unlikely meeting. When Sullivan arrived, Dr. Harris was already seated, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His expression was unreadable, but there was no hostility in his eyes, just a quiet understanding. "I owe you an apology," Sullivan said as he sat down, his voice heavy. "I never should have treated you the way I did. I don't know what got into me that day, but I can't undo it. I've been thinking about it every day since. I know I can't make it right, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I've been doing the work. I've been going to the sensitivity training, reading, learning about what I didn't see before. I want to be part of the change, not the problem." Dr. Harris studied him for a long moment before responding. He wasn't sure if Sullivan's words were motivated by guilt or a genuine desire to change. But in that moment, he realized something. Healing wasn't about winning or losing, it wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about moving forward, together. And while he couldn't erase the past, he could choose to embrace the possibility of progress. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Sullivan," Dr. Harris said slowly. "But it's not just about words. It's about actions. It's about understanding the people you serve and not just seeing them as others. I'm glad to hear you're willing to do the work, but this has to go beyond just the training. You have to hold yourself accountable every single day. And so do I." The conversation that followed was honest, raw, and filled with an undercurrent of shared understanding. They talked about the history of racial injustice, about the fractures that had existed long before the incident with Dr. Harris, and about the responsibility each person had to make things right. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Both men knew that their paths forward were not easy, and that the work was far from over. But they had taken a crucial step, and that was something neither of them could ignore. As time went on, the town of Harlington began to change in ways that could not be measured by headlines or public speeches. The police department implemented new policies aimed at building better relationships with the community. Community oversight boards were formed to ensure that law enforcement remained accountable. Dr. Harris's coalition of activists, healthcare workers, and educators pushed for better funding for schools and healthcare services in the areas that had long been neglected. Slowly, the divide that had once seemed insurmountable started to close. The emotional toll on Dr. Harris was immense. He had poured everything into this fight, often at the expense of his personal life. Michelle, his steadfast partner through it all, had stood by him, even as he found himself stretched thin with constant commitments and public appearances. It wasn't always easy. There were times when he wondered if the sacrifices were worth it. But when he looked around, when he saw the people who had supported him, those who believed in the vision of a better future for Harlington, he knew he had done the right thing. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and negotiations, Dr. Harris found himself standing on the steps of the hospital, looking out over the city he had worked so hard to protect. It had been a long and difficult road, and there was still so much work left to be done. But in that moment, he allowed himself a small sense of peace. Harlington had changed, but so had he. The fight had taken everything from him, but it had also given him something he had never expected, a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the power of community, and the knowledge that even the smallest actions could lead to monumental change. As the city lights twinkled below, Dr. Harris thought about the future. There would be more struggles ahead, more battles to fight. But he knew now, more than ever, that the work was worth it. The road to healing was long, but it was a road he was ready to walk. And he wasn't walking it alone. The community of Harlington had been through something transformative, and though the scars of the past would never disappear, they now had the chance to build something stronger, something better. The journey was far from over, but the spark of change had been lit, and it would burn brightly for years to come.